There are moments in life that no one sees coming. Not the person standing in the middle of it, not the people watching from the side, and certainly not the man who thought he already knew exactly how the day would end. Most of us walk through our routines believing we have a general sense of what each hour will bring. We wake up, we go through the motions, and we return home with nothing more than the quiet weight of another ordinary day behind us. But, every so often, life decides to interrupt that rhythm. It reaches into the middle of your most predictable moment and places something so unexpected, so deeply human, that it cracks you wide open in front of everyone, and you don't even feel embarrassed about it. You just feel grateful. You feel seen. And you realize, maybe for the first time in a long while, that the world still holds the capacity to genuinely surprise you. This is one of those stories. It didn't happen in a movie. It wasn't scripted by a writer sitting in a warm office somewhere. It happened in real life, in the open air, where real people stand and breathe and carry things they never talk about. And it started, as so many unforgettable moments do, with an ordinary man doing something simple, visiting a place that meant everything to him. His name was Daniel Marsh. He was 54 years old, and, on the outside, he looked like 1,000 other men you might pass on a Tuesday morning without a second glance. Medium height, slightly graying at the temples, the kind of quiet face that had learned, over decades, to carry its feelings somewhere beneath the surface rather than out in the open where the world could see them. He wore a dark jacket that morning, plain trousers, sensible shoes. He carried nothing except a small bunch of white flowers wrapped in paper and held against his chest with both hands the way you hold something you don't want to drop. He had driven 3 hours to get there. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because there was an event or a ceremony or a reason that the outside world would recognize as significant. He came because it was the anniversary, the 25th anniversary of the day his son had died, and, coming here, to this place, was the only thing that ever made that anniversary feel like something other than pure loss. His son, Thomas, had served as a Royal Guard. He had been 19 years old when he enlisted, full of the kind of energy and conviction that only the very young possess in that particular, untouched form. Thomas had stood at his post with the kind of discipline that made his father proud in ways he could never quite put into full sentences. There was something about watching your child stand completely still in the face of noise and distraction and curious tourists and maintain that absolute, unwavering composure. It made Daniel feel like maybe he had done something right. Like something good had passed from him to his boy without either of them fully realizing it. Thomas had died not in service, not in conflict. He had died in a car accident on a wet road, 25 years ago, 3 weeks before he was due to come home on leave. He was 23 years old. He had called his father the night before, and they had talked for 40 minutes about nothing important: football, the weather, a funny thing that happened in the mess hall. It was the last conversation they ever had, and Daniel had replayed every single word of it so many times over the years that the memory had taken on the texture of something worn smooth, like a stone carried too long in a pocket. Daniel had not come here seeking anyone's attention. He did not want to be seen or acknowledged or consoled. He simply came, as he had every single year for 25 years, to stand near the place where Thomas had once stood, to lay his flowers, and to be close to something that still carried his son's shape in the air. He approached the gate slowly. The morning was cool and gray, the kind of sky that doesn't commit to rain but doesn't promise sun either. There were a handful of tourists nearby, the usual scattering of people with cameras and guidebooks, milling about at a respectful distance from the guards who stood at their posts with the perfect stillness that the role demanded. Daniel had seen this scene so many times that it no longer felt strange to him. He knew the rhythm of it. He understood the silent agreement between the guards and the public. You can look, you can photograph, you can murmur to one another about how extraordinary it is that a human being can remain that motionless for that long, but you cannot cross the invisible line. You cannot intrude. He didn't intend to intrude. He never had. He found the spot he always came to, not the main entrance, not the most photographed point, but a quieter section along the fence line where Thomas had once stood during a particular rotation that Daniel had witnessed himself on one of his visits while Thomas was still alive. He remembered standing in nearly this exact spot, watching his son from a distance, not wanting to cause any disruption, just wanting to see him. Thomas had known he was there. Somehow, without breaking his stillness, without turning his head or changing the set of his expression, Thomas had communicated something, some small, almost imperceptible shift in his posture that Daniel had always interpreted as acknowledgement. As if to say, "I see you, Dad. I know you're there." Daniel had never told anyone about that moment. It felt too private to share. It was just his. He stood at the fence now and held his flowers and said nothing. Around him, the world continued its mild morning business. A child nearby pointed at one of the guards and said something in a language Daniel didn't recognize. A couple took a photograph. Someone checked their phone. Life moved at its ordinary pace, indifferent and gentle, the way it always does around grief that it doesn't know is present. Daniel wasn't crying. He rarely cried here anymore. In the early years he had, sometimes quite badly, and he had learned to come early in the morning when the crowds were thin so that no one would have to feel uncomfortable on his behalf. Now it was more like a full feeling, a pressure that sat behind his eyes and, in the center of his chest, not painful exactly, more like the sensation of holding something very large in a very small space. He set the flowers down at the base of the fence, carefully, the way he always did. He straightened up. He stood quietly for a moment, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes somewhere in the middle distance. And that was when he noticed the guard. It was not the guard closest to him. It was the one stationed about 20 feet to his left, slightly recessed in his position, facing forward with the full composed authority of the role. Daniel had barely glanced at him when he arrived. The guards were always there, always the same in their magnificent stillness, and Daniel respected them too much to stare. But something made him look now, some peripheral awareness of movement, or perhaps not movement exactly, but a quality of attention. A sense that someone was paying very close attention to him. He turned his head slowly. The guard was looking at him. Not in the way that guards occasionally let their eyes move across the scene before them, the trained, alert but neutral sweep that takes in information without landing anywhere particular. This guard was looking directly at him. Specifically. With an expression that, even from 20 feet away, even from beneath the polished peak of a ceremonial bearskin, Daniel could identify as something real. Something human. Daniel didn't know what to make of it. He held the guard's gaze for a moment, confused, and then looked away, embarrassed in that instinctive way people feel embarrassed when they believe they've accidentally drawn too much attention to themselves. He fixed his eyes back on the flowers he'd placed against the fence and told himself he had imagined it. Guards didn't do that. Guards didn't look at you like that. It was probably nothing. He stood a little longer. He thought about Thomas. He thought about the last phone call. He thought about the way Thomas used to make a particular face when he was trying not to laugh at something he knew he shouldn't find funny, this barely contained, corner of the mouth struggle that always made Daniel laugh first, which then made Thomas completely lose the battle. He thought about that face. He hadn't thought about that specific face in a long time, and thinking about it now made something loosen unexpectedly in his chest. He pressed his lips together. He blinked. He was about to step back, about to begin the long process of pulling himself away from this place and back into the motion of the day, when he heard something. It was quiet at first. So quiet that he genuinely wasn't sure he was hearing it. He thought maybe it was someone nearby humming to themselves, or a distant radio, or one of those strange acoustics that open spaces sometimes produce where sound from somewhere far away becomes oddly audible for just a moment. But then, it got slightly clearer, and his whole body went still. Someone was singing. It was low and slow, barely above a murmur, but it was unmistakably singing. And it was coming from the direction of the guard to his left. Daniel turned again, slowly, as if he was afraid that moving too quickly might make the sound stop. The guard had not broken his stance. He was still perfectly positioned, still facing forward with the full composure of his post. His lips were barely moving. But the sound was real, and it was deliberate, and it was growing just slightly in clarity as Daniel listened more carefully. He recognized the melody. His legs nearly gave out. It was a song. A specific song. One that Thomas had loved as a teenager, an old song, not famous, not the kind of thing you would stumble across by accident. It was a song that Thomas's mother used to sing to him when he was small, that he had carried with him into adulthood and quietly claimed as his own. It was a song that Daniel associated so completely and exclusively with his son that hearing it from any other source felt structurally impossible. He stood completely still. The world around him continued to function. The tourists moved and murmured. The sky held its gray light. But Daniel was no longer part of any of that. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere made entirely of the sound of that melody drifting toward him on the cool morning air from the mouth of a young guard who was still standing perfectly at his post, perfectly still, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Daniel didn't move. He couldn't. He just stood there, his hands hanging at his sides now, his face doing things he had no control over, listening. And, he thought, how? How could this be happening? How could this young man, this guard, this stranger, know that song? Know it well enough to sing it? Know to sing it now, here, to him? The question rose in him like something rising through water, slow, unstoppable, heading toward a surface he couldn't see yet. And, beneath the question, beneath the shock and the confusion and the fierce grip of a grief he thought he had long since learned to manage, something else rose too. Something warm. Something that felt, against all logic, like being seen. Like being found in the middle of a crowd by someone who had been looking for you specifically. Daniel pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. He breathed through his nose. He did not look away from the guard. The song continued, low and steady and quiet, like something meant only for one person to hear. And, for the first time in 25 years of standing at this fence and laying his flowers and carrying his grief in silence, Daniel Marsh did not feel alone. The song ended the way it had begun, quietly, without announcement, dissolving back into the ambient sounds of the morning as if it had never been anything more than a trick of the wind. But Daniel knew what he had heard. Every cell in his body knew it. He stood at the fence for a long moment after the last note faded, absolutely motionless, his hands still hovering near his mouth, his eyes fixed on the young guard who had returned or perhaps had never left the perfect, impenetrable stillness of his post. Nothing in the guard's bearing suggested that anything had occurred. He was exactly as he had been when Daniel first arrived, upright, composed, eyes forward, expression neutral in that particular way that is not blankness but rather a kind of controlled depth, the way very still water is not empty but simply not disturbed. If you had walked past him in that moment and knew nothing of what had just happened, you would have seen nothing. Just a guard, doing his job, on an ordinary gray morning. But Daniel had not walked past. Daniel had been standing 20 feet away, facing him, hearing every quiet note. He didn't know what to do. Social convention, the deep-seated instinct that had governed his behavior at this fence for 25 years, told him to do nothing. To respect the silence. To understand that whatever had just happened existed in a category that could not and should not be responded to with noise or gesture or any kind of intrusion on the guard's post. The rules were the rules, and Daniel understood them, and he had always honored them because he had raised a son who had lived by them. But his feet didn't move. He stood where he was and stared at the guard and felt the full, strange weight of the moment pressing down on him from every direction. Around him, the tourists continued their gentle orbits. A woman laughed at something her companion said. A child asked a question. Someone adjusted the strap on a camera bag. All of it felt very far away, as if Daniel were watching it through glass from a different room. The world had split into two layers, the one everyone else was inhabiting, and the one he was standing in alone, which contained only him and this young man who had just done something that defied every expectation Daniel had walked in with. He thought about leaving. He told himself he should leave, that staying too long was already edging toward behavior that might cause a disruption, might draw attention, might create a situation that the guard would have to manage in some way. He didn't want to put the young man in a difficult position. He didn't want to be a problem. He had spent 25 years being careful not to make his grief into anyone else's burden. But he also couldn't make himself walk away from what had just been offered to him. So he did the only thing that felt honest without being intrusive. He pressed both hands flat against the front of his jacket, over his chest, over the place where the feeling was living. He gave one small, deliberate nod in the direction of the guard. Not theatrical, not demanding of response. Just an acknowledgement, offered into the space between them, carrying everything he couldn't say. Then, he turned and walked away. He made it about 40 meters before his legs became unreliable. He stopped near a low wall and sat down on it heavily, not caring how he looked, not checking whether anyone was watching. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he breathed slow and deliberate, the way you breathe when you are trying to hold something in, and then, the way you breathe when you realize you no longer have the strength to hold it, and it's going to come out regardless. He wept. Not the controlled, private, managed kind of grief he was accustomed to allowing himself in small doses on this particular day each year. He wept the way he hadn't wept in a very long time, openly, with his whole body, the kind of release that starts somewhere deep and rises without asking permission and takes everything loose with it on the way up. He cried for Thomas. He cried for the 25 years. He cried for the wet road and the phone call and the face Thomas used to make when he was trying not to laugh. He cried because a stranger had sung an impossible song, and it had undone him completely, and he didn't understand how or why, and he was grateful beyond any measure he had words for. A woman nearby asked if he was all right. He looked up, embarrassed, and nodded, and managed to say yes, thank you, I'm fine, just a difficult day. She gave him the look that kind people give to strangers in pain, warm, respectful of the boundary, not pushing further but making it clear that she had seen him and that seeing him mattered. She moved on. He was grateful for that too. He sat on the wall for a while. The gray sky above him finally made a decision and released a very light rain, the kind so fine it's barely more than a mist, and Daniel tipped his face up slightly and let it settle on his skin and thought about nothing in particular for a few minutes, which was itself a gift. Eventually he stood up. He dried his face with his sleeve. He straightened his jacket. He looked back in the direction he had come from, though from this distance and angle the guard's post was no longer visible. He thought about the young man standing there, still at his position, still composed, still fulfilling his duty with the same absolute dedication that Thomas had brought to the same role, and he felt something that was both like pride and like love and like grief all wound together into a single sensation that had no clean name. He began to walk back to his car. But, before he reached the end of the path, something stopped him. Not an external force, no one spoke to him, no one called his name. It was internal. The feeling that he was walking away from something incomplete, something that had been started but not finished, not because the guard owed him anything more but because Daniel himself had something left to give. He had a habit of writing. Not formally, not for publication, not even for anyone else's eyes particularly. He had started keeping a journal the year Thomas died, on the advice of a grief counselor who had told him that the act of writing things down could help to give shape to feelings that otherwise just floated loose and caused damage. He had written in that journal for 25 years. Some entries were long and detailed. Some were a single line. Some were just dates. But he had never missed the anniversary, and he had always written something on this day. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small notebook, the kind with a soft cover, small enough to fit in a hand. He always brought it on this day. He uncapped the pen he kept clipped to the inside cover and stood there at the edge of the path in the fine mist and wrote 3 sentences. Then, he tore the page out carefully. He folded it twice. He held it in his hand and looked at it for a moment. He walked back. He approached the fence again, this time from a slightly different angle, not wanting to crowd the guard's position unnecessarily. He found a spot near a small information board, the kind with a notice pinned behind a plastic panel. He tucked the folded note behind the edge of the panel, not hidden exactly, but placed with care, somewhere that someone who was looking might find it and someone who wouldn't necessarily notice it at all. It felt right. It felt like leaving a message for someone at a place you both know, trusting that they'll come by eventually. What he had written was this: "My son stood where you stand. He died 25 years ago today. I have come every year since and never expected anything from this place except the chance to be near him. Today you gave me something I will carry for the rest of my life. I don't know how you knew that song. I don't know if you'll ever know what it meant. But, thank you." From a father who needed to hear it, *, he stepped back from the notice board. He looked once more toward the guard, a different one now. The rotation had changed, and the young man who had sung was no longer at that particular post. Daniel scanned the wider area quietly, wondering if he could identify him elsewhere in the line, and then decided it didn't matter. The note would reach him or it wouldn't. Either way, it had been written and placed. Either way, the feeling behind it was real and complete. He walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for a few minutes. The rain had picked up slightly, real rain now, fine and steady. He watched it run down the windscreen in small tributaries that joined and split and joined again in ways that looked almost deliberate. He thought about connections. About the strange invisible threads that run between people who have never met, between a dead young man and a living young man, between a grief carried alone for 25 years and a melody that had no business being in that place on that morning. He thought Thomas would have loved this. The sheer, improbable, magnificent strangeness of it. He would have heard the story and made that face, the barely contained, corner of the mouth face, and then he would have said something quietly funny about it that made the whole thing simultaneously lighter and more precious. Daniel started the car. He didn't know, as he pulled away from the curb and out into the wet streets, that the note he had left behind the information board had already been found. He didn't know that one of the civilian staff members who maintained the area had seen him place it and, recognizing in the gesture something too deliberate to be litter, had retrieved it and read it and then stood very still for a moment in the gray morning, holding a stranger's grief in her hands, deciding what to do with it. He didn't know that she had taken it inside and shown it to her supervisor, who had read it twice and then walked down the corridor to a small office where the guards went between rotations. He didn't know that the note was placed on the table in that room with a quiet word about where it had come from and what the man who left it had looked like. He didn't know that by the time he was 30 miles down the road, heading home through the rain, the note had made its way to the young guard who had sung. His name was William. He was 26 years old. He had been in his role for 18 months, and he was regarded by his colleagues as one of the more quietly serious members of the unit, not cold, never cold, but the kind of person who felt things deeply and expressed very little of it on the surface. He sat in the break room with the note unfolded in his hands and read it, and then read it again, and then set it down on the table in front of him and looked at it without expression for a long moment. His colleague seated across from him, who had been watching, said, "You all right, Will?" William looked up. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'm all right." But he picked the note back up and folded it again and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, where he would carry it for the rest of that day and the day after and, though he didn't yet know this, for many days and weeks beyond. The story of how William had come to know that particular song was not simple, and it was not the kind of thing he had spoken about much at work. It involved his own losses, his own accumulated weight of things carried quietly over years. It involved a specific morning 2 weeks earlier when he had been standing at his post and a man had walked past who moved in a way, the particular set of the shoulders, the deliberate pace, the flowers, that had reminded William of something he couldn't fully name, something that lived in the space between recognition and memory. And he had felt, in a way that he would have difficulty explaining to anyone, that he should do something. Not a large thing. Not an intrusive thing. Just something small and human and true. He had not planned to sing. It had simply risen in him the way things rise when you stop overthinking and let the instinct lead, and the song that rose was the one his own grandmother used to sing, an old quiet song that he had always associated with the idea of someone watching over you from a place you couldn't see. He had sung it barely above his breath, aimed at the gray morning air, aimed at the man with the flowers and the grief and the particular kind of stillness that only belongs to people who have been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He had not expected the man to hear him. He had not expected to be answering a grief that was 25 years old. He had not expected any of this, and yet here he was, sitting in a break room with a folded note in his chest pocket and a feeling in his body that he recognized, because he had felt it before, as the specific weight of something that matters. Outside, the rain continued. The guards on duty stood at their posts. The tourists moved in their gentle, curious patterns. The day unfolded the way days do, one ordinary moment after another, carrying inside it, as ordinary days always do, the extraordinary things that no one ever sees coming until they're already standing in the middle of them. William sat with his tea cooling beside him and the note against his heart and thought about a man he had never spoken to, and a young man he had never known, and a song that had apparently traveled from one grief to another across 25 years, and an open yard on a rainy morning in a way that should have been impossible and wasn't. He thought, I want to find him. The thought surprised him with its clarity. It wasn't a vague wish. It wasn't idle curiosity. It was a clear, clean, purposeful feeling, the sense that the story was not over, that the note was not an ending but a beginning, and that there was something unfinished between himself and Daniel Marsh that needed, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, to be finished. He didn't act on it immediately. He was cautious by nature, and he was aware that the idea required careful consideration. He couldn't simply reach out to a stranger who had come to grieve in a public space. There were proper ways to do things, and there were deeply improper ways, and he had no intention of turning a man's private sorrow into something uncomfortable or invasive. But the thought stayed with him. And, outside, the rain came down, steady and fine, over a city full of people carrying things they never talk about, walking past one another every day without knowing what the other is holding. And, somewhere on a wet highway 30 miles out, Daniel Marsh drove home with something in his chest that felt different from what he'd carried in. Something lighter. Something like the beginning of being less alone. 2 weeks passed. Daniel returned to his life the way you return to a room after something in it has quietly shifted. Everything was in the same place, the furniture unchanged, the routines intact, but the quality of the light seemed different somehow, the air carrying a residue of something that hadn't been there before. He went back to work. He cooked his meals. He read in the evenings and slept reasonably well. He called his sister on Sunday as he always did. None of it had changed. But he thought about the guard constantly. Not in an obsessive way, not in a way that disrupted anything. More like the way you think about a piece of music that lodges in you after a single hearing and resurfaces at quiet moments, in the shower, at a red light, in the space between waking and sleep. He would be doing something entirely unrelated, reaching for a cup or locking the back door, and it would arrive again, the sound of that song drifting toward him across the morning air, barely audible, absolutely certain. He would stop for a moment. Feel the full weight of it again. And then, continue with whatever he was doing, carrying it. He told his sister about it on one of their Sunday calls. He had hesitated, because he was a private man and this felt like a private thing, but he found that he wanted to say it out loud to someone he trusted, to hear whether the story sounded as extraordinary in his own words as it felt in his chest. He told her carefully, starting with where he had been and why, moving through the morning chronologically, pausing at the part where he described the sound of the song and the recognition that hit him when he realized which song it was. His sister was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then, she said, "Daniel, do you know how extraordinary that is?" "Yes," he said. "I think I do. That guard chose to do that. He didn't have to. No one asked him to. He just felt something and responded to it. That's a kind of human decency that's hard to come by." "I know. Thomas would have loved that story." "I know," Daniel said again. "I thought about that on the drive home." Another silence. Then, "Are you all right?" He considered the question honestly before answering, which was something he had started doing more carefully since the morning at the fence. "I think I'm better than I was before I went," he said. "Which is new. Usually I come back from that day feeling emptied out. This time I came back feeling like something had been returned to me." He didn't know what to do with that feeling except hold it carefully and be grateful for it. Then, the letter arrived. It came on a Thursday, ordinary post, a plain white envelope with his name and address written in handwriting he didn't recognize, careful, slightly formal, the kind of handwriting that suggests someone who was thinking about what they were doing while they were doing it. He stood at his door and looked at the envelope for a moment before opening it. There was no return address. The postmark was from the city he had visited 2 weeks before. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. He unfolded it and read. "Dear Mr. Marsh, you don't know me. My name is William. I am the guard who sang, I found your note the same day you left it, through a kindness from one of the staff here who thought I should have it. I have read it many times. I have thought a great deal about how to respond, and whether I should, and what the right thing to do might be. I don't want to intrude on a grief that is yours. I don't know if it's my place to reach out. But I keep coming back to what you wrote, and to the morning itself, and to the feeling that there is something unfinished between us, or rather, something that began and deserves to be properly acknowledged. I want to tell you how I know that song, if you would let me. And I want to tell you something about that morning that I think you should hear. If you'd like to meet, I would be honored. If you would prefer I leave you in peace, I will completely understand, and I hope you'll know regardless that singing that morning was one of the truest things I have ever done. With respect, William. There was a phone number at the bottom of the page. Daniel read the letter 3 times. He set it down on his kitchen table and made himself a cup of tea and drank it standing at the window looking out at the garden, which was very green in the October light, and he thought about what he wanted. Not what he should want. Not what made practical or logical sense. What he actually, genuinely, truly wanted. He wanted to meet William. He called the number that evening. It rang 4 times, and then a voice answered, young, slightly cautious, the particular tone of someone who was not sure what they're about to receive. Hello? Is this William? Daniel asked. A pause. Yes. Is this Mr. Marsh? Daniel, he said. Please, just Daniel. Another pause, smaller this time. And then, something in the voice relaxed, as if a breath had been released. Okay. Daniel. I'm glad you called. They spoke for an hour that first time. Or rather, they talked carefully, like 2 people who understand that they are handling something delicate and don't want to drop it. Daniel asked William how his note had found him, and William told him about the staff member and the break room and the folded paper against his chest. Daniel listened and felt something move in him that he had no word for. Then, William asked if Daniel would be willing to hear how he knew the song, and Daniel said yes, and William told him. William had grown up in a house full of a particular kind of silence. His father had been a soldier, not Royal Guards, a different regiment, a different era, and had come home from a deployment when William was 7 years old, changed in ways that the 7-year-old William could feel but not name. His father had struggled. Not visibly, not in ways that drew attention from outside the family, but internally, in the deep quiet of a man who had seen things he couldn't unknit from himself. His grandmother, who lived with them, had been the warmth in that house. She had sung. She had sung all the time, while she cooked, while she moved through the rooms, sometimes just sitting in a chair with her eyes closed, moving her lips to melodies that seemed to come from somewhere very far back. The song that William had sung at his post that morning was one of hers. He had absorbed it so completely that it lived in him the way his grandmother's voice still lived in him, as something that could surface without warning when the right conditions presented themselves. His grandmother had died 4 years ago. William had enlisted the following year, drawn to the precision and discipline of the role in the same way his father had been drawn to service, because some people are built in such a way that structure becomes a form of stability, and stability becomes a form of survival. He had been at his post that morning, 2 weeks ago, and had looked out across the yard and seen a man walking slowly toward the fence with white flowers pressed to his chest. He had watched the man for as long as his position allowed and felt something he recognized without being able to name, the specific gravity of sustained grief. The way it moved differently from ordinary sadness. The way it carried itself with a particular kind of quiet dignity that came only from years of practice. He had not planned to sing. He had told Daniel the same thing he had told himself in the break room that afternoon, it simply rose. The song came up from wherever it had been living and found its way out before William could think about whether it was appropriate or correct or compliant with anything. It was instinctive and honest and aimed at a man he didn't know, from a song he had inherited from a woman he had loved, offered across the morning air in the simple hope that it might land on the right person in the right way. I didn't know if you heard it, William told him. After you turned and looked at me, I wasn't sure. And then, I saw your face. Daniel made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. Something in between. You knew, then, he said. I knew, William said. And I'm glad. I was worried it might feel like an intrusion. That maybe it was wrong of me. It was the opposite of an intrusion, Daniel said. It was the most generous thing a stranger has ever done for me. They agreed to meet the following Saturday morning. Not at the fence, neither of them suggested that, as if by unspoken agreement they both understood that the fence was a place for private ceremonies and should remain so. They chose a cafe nearby, the kind of place with wooden tables and large windows and the comfortable noise of an ordinary morning, where two people who had shared something extraordinary could sit across from each other and let the space between them breathe. Daniel arrived first. He chose a table near the window and sat with his hands around a coffee cup and felt the specific nervousness of a moment you can feel the weight of in advance. He wasn't sure what he was nervous about exactly. He had spoken to William on the phone. He knew something about him now. The nervousness wasn't social anxiety, it was something larger, the feeling of being about to complete a circuit that had been open for 2 weeks, humming with unresolved current, and not knowing quite what the completion would feel like. William came in at exactly the time they had agreed. Daniel recognized him immediately, not from memory, he had never had a clear view of his face, but from something in the way he moved, the slight self-containment, the quality of a person who was used to occupying space with control and intention. He was younger than Daniel had imagined from his voice on the phone. Sandy-haired, somewhat serious-looking, wearing a plain jacket over a light shirt. He scanned the room, found Daniel, and crossed toward him with the directness of someone who has decided not to be nervous even if they are. They shook hands. They sat down. A moment of adjustment, two strangers who were not quite strangers anymore finding the right social register for something that had no obvious category. Then, William said, "How are you?" And, I mean that genuinely, not as a pleasantry. Something in Daniel unlocked at that. He laughed, softly, and said, "Better than I've been on this particular anniversary in many years." "Which is entirely your doing." They talked for almost 3 hours. The cafe filled and quieted around them and filled again, the morning moving through its stages in the background, and they sat at their wooden table by the window and exchanged themselves carefully at first, and then, with increasing ease, the way people do when they discover that the other person is safe. Daniel told William about Thomas. Not the summary version, not the facts-only version, but the real version, the laugh, the phone call, the 23 years of life that had been so fully and, specifically Thomas, that even describing him now, decades on, the particularity of the boy remained vivid and present. He told William about the 25 years of anniversaries. About the spot at the fence. About the way he had come to think of those visits not as mourning exactly but as maintenance, the ongoing work of keeping something alive in the face of everything that pushes toward forgetting. William listened. He listened the way that only certain people can listen, not waiting for his turn, not preparing his response, but genuinely receiving. When Daniel finished, he sat quietly for a moment with his hands flat on the table and then said, "He sounds like someone I would have wanted to know." "He would have liked you," Daniel said. "He respected what you do. He took it very seriously. But he also had a ridiculous sense of humor, and I have a feeling you do too, and he would have found a way to make you both laugh about something before the day was out." William smiled at that, a genuine one, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth, and Daniel saw it and felt something so precisely like Thomas's face in that moment that he had to look away briefly and recalibrate. William told Daniel about his grandmother. About his father. About the way he had come to the role not despite his family's history with service and its costs but somehow because of it, because he believed, on a level he couldn't always put into rational words, that there was something worth protecting in the act of standing a post with full commitment and full dignity. That the ceremony wasn't hollow. That the stillness wasn't performance. That it was a form of honor, paid daily, without recognition, as a way of insisting that some things deserve to be treated seriously. Thomas believed that, Daniel said. Completely. "I know," William said. "And then, quietly, I felt that. When I saw you at the fence. I felt the weight of what you were carrying and I felt who it was for, in some way. I can't explain that. But I felt it." Daniel nodded. He didn't ask William to explain it further. Some things don't require explanation. Some things simply happen in the space between people who are paying full attention to the world, and the only honest response is to receive them. Before they left, William reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table between them. It was a small photograph, printed on ordinary paper, slightly worn at the edges. It showed a woman older, seated in a chair, laughing at something outside the frame of the image, her head slightly tilted, her hands folded in her lap. She had a quality of warmth so complete that it was visible in a photograph taken years ago by a grandson who loved her. "My grandmother," William said. "She's the one who gave me the song." Daniel looked at the photograph for a long time. He thought about the chain of it, the way the song had passed from a grandmother to a grandson and, from the grandson across an open yard to a grieving father and, from the father's grief back to the source of the song itself, all of it moving in a circle that no one had designed or planned or could have predicted. He thought about the improbability of all of it and felt something that was not quite religious but was adjacent to it, the feeling that the world has patterns that run beneath the visible surface, and that sometimes, in certain moments, on certain gray October mornings, you get a glimpse of one. He looked up at William. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it. For the song, for the note, for this. For being the kind of person who does something when they feel called to do it instead of talking themselves out of it." William inclined his head. "Thank you for coming back 25 years in a row," he said. "That kind of love, that kind of consistency, that's not nothing, Daniel." Thomas knew he was loved. He had to have known. Daniel pressed his lips together. He nodded once, the same small deliberate nod he had given at the fence 2 weeks ago, carrying everything he had no words for. They walked out of the cafe together into the autumn morning. The sky was clearer than it had been on the anniversary day, the kind of pale blue that feels like a promise rather than a statement. They stood on the pavement for a moment and said they should do this again, both of them meaning it, and shook hands, and went their separate ways. Daniel walked back to his car slowly. He was not crying. He was not full of the aching heaviness that normally accompanied this particular stretch of autumn. He felt something quieter and steadier than that, something that had the quality of rest after a long exertion, of weight set down after a long carrying. He stood by his car before getting in and tipped his face up to the October sky and breathed. Somewhere in the city, a young guard named William walked back toward a place where he would stand tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, in complete silence, with complete composure, performing an act that most people observed without understanding its depth. And, somewhere in the air between all of this, between the fence and the cafe and the wet road 25 years ago and a grandmother singing in a warm kitchen and a young man who never came home, something moved. Quiet and patient and real, the way the best things always are. Thomas Marsh had been loved thoroughly and, without compromise by his father for every single one of the 25 years since his death. And, on a gray October morning, because a young man with his grandmother's song in his chest had listened to his instinct and let it move through him, Daniel Marsh had finally, fully, felt that love received. Not returned. Not answered. Just received, held up and reflected back to him from an unexpected direction, proof that what he had given his whole life to was not lost, not dissolved, not swallowed by the years. Still present. Still real. Still, in all the ways that mattered most, alive.